Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of some drawing commentary. This session will be pretty much about landscape drawing and painting. It's from a page of Mindfold, which is a webcomic that I update once in a blue moon. This particular page is going to be divided into 3 horizontal panels. Each one of them has a landscape that's telling a different part of the story. And since most of the concept design for these landscapes has already been completed, it's pretty much just an exercise in formal layout. By formal, I mean how the forms are going to spread about on the canvas. So what I've done here is I did some very rough line work just in black and white on a layer that's set to multiply mode to just map out how I want masses and shapes and sight lines and important objects to lay out on the canvas. And then I'm immediately going into mapping out my color. And the way I'm doing that is I'm just taking some photographs that have the color family that I want to see happening and then dropping it into the page and sampling those colors and just sort of smearing them all over the place. So the original photograph will disappear completely. It's just about finding those color families that I like. And now I've already collapsed my original black and white line work down onto the color. All I'm doing now is I'm drawing with my very rough brushes right on top of that line work and completely obscuring the original layout. The brush I'm using is almost like just a straight line. It's like 100 pixels wide and about 2 pixels thick, so it emulates the quality of a palette knife almost, where I can, depending on how I tilt it, I can either get a big broad stroke or a 2 pixel line, and I can get a nice sense of gesture and a sweeping motion that can start to direct the eye where I want it to go. And the narrative beats of this page it's depicting the characters in the story flying in an airplane over this desolate desert landscape. And the first panel is that they're very far away from these tortuous cliff formations. The second panel is they're starting to fly their airplane very close to one of those cliff formations, and there's this abandoned city way off in the background. And the third panel is where they're flying quite close to that abandoned city, and you can see more of the details of the buildings and stuff. And like I said, most of this is really a sort of just compositional escapades. I'm just drawing big shapes on the page and making pleasant looking shapes, not so much concerned about selling a very specific concept. We already know from previous stages in the page that this landscape is almost like what you would see in like Monument Valley or the Grand Canyon in the US. Very large, very dramatic, very imposing rock structures and a very arid environment. Again, all I'm doing here is I'm just finding pleasant shapes. There's no reason why that cliff is shaped in that particular form, and just adjusting stuff accordingly. And you can also kind of see, even though these are panels in a page and each panel in the comic book is its own separate entity, the way that the entire page lays out in its entirety should also be considered. And right now there's a lot of mass on the right side of the page. There's those big rock formations in the top panel that are on the right, and then this dark overhanging rock formations also on the right. It's sort of making the page look a little bit heavy towards the right, and I end up changing that quite a bit because I don't like the way that the eye is sort of moving across the entire page right now. And as you can see, I've also dropped in some foliage. I just took a photograph of some jungle trees and dropped them in, and now I'm sampling those colors and adding some greens. And when I'm done with that, the original trees are just going to barely poke through it all as a hint of a texture, and it's mostly going to be just the colors that I care about. And in fact, that green is a little bit too intense. I probably will get rid of most of that because again, I want this to be a very dry desert. And what I'm doing now is I'm taking a rock texture and dropping it on top of there and setting the blend mode of that new layer to soft light. And I'm not doing this because I'm trying to create a photo montage. Like if you do digital matte painting for movies and stuff, those artists will definitely use an actual photograph and blend it in there so that the photograph really becomes the content of the painting. And that's not what I'm doing here. What I'm doing here is I'm just giving myself a sense of grain, sort of like something that pushes me in a particular direction as I'm rendering these rocks. It's sort of like the grain. When I say grain, I mean like the grain in wood, where if you make a sculpture, if you carve a sculpture out of wood that's made out of redwood burl, it's going to be very different than if you carve a sculpture that's made out of balsa wood or something. That internal, intrinsic grain of the wood is going to influence the kinds of carvings and kinds of forms that look pleasant to you. So what I'm doing here is the same thing. I'm just imposing some sort of natural grain on myself and then reacting to that. And when I'm done with this, the viewer will see there's some sort of rock looking stuff there, but it won't really be recognizable as the original stone texture that I used. And here I'm using both that very palette knife-ish looking brush and a textured brush that's really triangular in shape, so I can get sort of very precise corners and big washes of the color depending on how I'm tilting that brush. And a sort of a happy accident here, that stone texture that I used is lending a greenish texture to, a greenish hue rather, to the reflected light, which works out well because the green bushes underneath would be reflecting a green tinted light up into the shadow areas. And let's see, I'm still not happy with that shape. So big, normally this is, I would prefer to avoid these kind of really big revisions this late in the game, but like I said earlier, the whole way that the eye flowed over this page wasn't making me happy, so I just flipped that whole panel, mirror imaged it, and now the way that the rhythm of the page works is more there's a big mass at the very top of the page on the right, and then the eye flows to the left in the middle of the page, and then it's going to flow back to the right at the bottom panel. So it's purely just giving a nice user experience. There's no conceptual reason why I decided to change my composition that way. And since I flipped that cliff 180 degrees, or rather flipped it into a mirror image, I had to recalculate how all my lights and shadows work, which is sort of a pain in the ass, but it was necessary to make that composition work properly. You can also see I've gone in a few times now and added some red using a big brush set to multiply, because the concept design of this desert world is that it's more reddish than it is orange. So every now and then I have to go back and bring those reds back in there. I'm adding right now these sort of horizontal crevice features to that cliff in the foreground, which is giving you the indication that it's that sort of sedimentary rock like you'd see in the Grand Canyon. But all of those, and I made a mistake there, those horizontal crevices in that cliff should not be parallel, because if they're parallel like you're seeing right now, it's creating sort of a telephoto lens effect, like that cliff is very far away, which is not what I want. I want that cliff to feel like it's imposing over you, like it's looming over your head, and the viewer really gets a sense of this huge rock that they're standing underneath. So those horizontal lines have been changed now so that they're more of an elliptical shape, so that they're following perspective, that you're getting a sense that this is a photograph that was taken in a wide angle lens, and your user is, the viewer is put right into the middle of the action. That's usually what I do in most of my drawings. I like those wide angle shots because it pulls the viewer right into the middle of the scene, rather than a telephoto, which gives you the impression that you're standing very far away and you're more removed from the action. Whereas now the feature on the right, which is that abandoned city, is really going to be rendered more as if it's in a telephoto look, where it's much, I want that very flattened out perspective for that city feature back there, because that's going to help to push it back into the distance. And everything I'm doing right now is helping that illusion. I'm putting a pool of light there in between the foreground and the midground to sort of create some space in the scene. And that the city that I'm working on right now is really the hero object of this panel. So that cliff in the foreground gives me a sense of the ponderous scale of this world, but the main function of this panel is really to acquaint the viewer with more of the history of this world, more of the conceptual underpinnings of this world, which is that it should be like a very ancient world. And I don't mean geologically, I mean like there are these ancient civilizations that have come and gone and left these artifacts behind, and that sort of ancient abandoned quality should be starting to become apparent to the reader, and I'm reinforcing that, which is quite a challenge for a designer, because since this is an imaginary alien world with imaginary alien civilizations on it, what I need to do now is come up with an entire architectural vernacular out of thin air. Like, I have to create a system of decorative arts and folk art of these imaginary civilizations, which is a huge amount of work, designing a bunch of houses and artifacts and whatnot. And the way I'm going to do that is essentially by cheating. I'm going to take recognizable objects from Earth and then create what are essentially controlled collisions, where I'm going to take different aesthetic languages of architecture and industrial design and gradually layer them on top of each other and pull out the features that I like and push back the features that I don't want in there, and create that same sense of an underlying grain, like a texture to respond to as an artist. And what I did there is I took Gaudi's Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, and I dropped it on top of my underpainting, set the blend mode to soft light and probably set the transparency to about 50% or so, and then just blended it in. And now I'm taking a Buddhist temple from Thailand, and I'm gonna drop it right on top, and I'm gonna create these random collisions of aesthetics, so that there's two inputs. One is Art Nouveau and one is Buddhist, and they're going to create an output that's something in between, and then I'm going to go back in and emphasize the parts that I like and erase the parts that I don't like. And the important thing that's happening is that the viewer will look at that and say, yeah, that's some sort of structure that was built by humanoids, and that's some sort of structure that is inhabited by humanoids, and I believe it. It's believable, but it's not from planet Earth. It's some other alien architecture, but it's still architecture, because you want to create a sense of originality, like this is a totally new world that no one's ever seen before, but you don't want to alienate the viewers either. Like, you don't want to make a city that's made all out of soap bubbles or something. It should still be something that people can relate to. And this is just a process. Again, it's just a starting point. It's not the finished product. It's a process of layering these different kinds of formal vocabularies on top of each other, and gradually getting totally new output. And again, these are all structures where people can look at it and say, yeah, I could imagine people are living in there, even though I don't quite understand what each little feature is. It looks like something that could be inhabited by some sort of humanoids that people can relate to. And gradually, and here, this is my third cultural ripoff. This is a doorway from a Viking chieftain's house from like the 1200s or something like that. And the original object was like maybe a meter high, and I've dropped it in here now into a totally different context and made it into some sort of architectural feature that's maybe 100 meters high. But that completely different, sinuous quality is being dropped upon the very rectilinear qualities of that cathedral, and creating an output that's a completely different result from the original inputs. And I'm just gradually, sometimes like selecting by color range to just erase different parts of that meshwork, and coming back in with brushes set to multiply mode to add an overall color family so that it blends into the context of the underlying parts, and definitely dropping the transparency way down so that all of those different elements are poking through and giving me a blend of all those different aesthetics. And you can see on the right, I'm only working in 2 layers. The landscape is all done in single layer work, and now that city is a separate layer. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to be going back and forth and adjusting the silhouette of those towers. And also, since this is an abandoned city, I'm starting to destroy it, and I'm pulling out little holes where the sky beyond can show through. The way I'm doing that is with a layer mask. So even though it looks like I'm erasing information, I'm actually just making that information not available. So I can actually go back and forth and paint into the layer mask and either take information away or unerase it and bring that part of the drawing back into view. And at this point, I think I've pretty much finished up with layering all of my cultural references that I stole from other cultures, and I'm just going in and starting to integrate that stuff into the scene and starting to emphasize the areas that I like and kind of obscure the areas that I don't like. And as you can see here, going back with some more color balance, just reaffirming that red and reaffirming that sense of space where I want foreground, midground, background, and then extreme background. You can see those other cliffs just barely poking out of the mist, and this pool of light as if there's like a sunbeam of light poking through the clouds that's illuminating that ground right in between the cliffs. Here I'm going back in with even more of that grain, so I'm referencing objects that will give the viewer a sense, yes, there's some sort of rock-like activity going on here, but I don't want it to be photo montage. I don't want the viewer to see every little rock and pebble in that texture that I just dropped in there. It's just more of to give the viewer a sense of an underlying grain, like, yes, this is believable as nature, but I could never identify it as some particular spot or some sort of particular type of rock. And you can see I'm coming in there now with that triangular brush, and I'm just blending different parts that I like and putting shadows that make more sense based on where the sunlight is coming from, and adding some reflected lights and obscuring other reflected lights. But this is really a process of where I have to like become nature. I have to imagine myself as being a rock and being like, why is that crack there? How will I extend that protrusion or that crevice? And if I were a rock, what would I be doing right now in terms of like how to map out that texture? And again, I'm just working on a single layer, so I can go back and forth and push and pull the contour of that rock. I can either push more dark rock out, or I can push more sky in so that I can just refine that silhouette of the rock. And this is all just going back and forth, integrating objects, cleaning up the contours of where I want lights and shadows to be, and just starting to make the whole composition work more cohesively. And that's actually going to be a very long process. I'm not going to be recording the whole thing because that would just make the video go on forever and ever. But again, I'm just stacking more and more grain and cleaning up different textures and stuff. You can see now I've jumped ahead to the final product. So I've added a few more refinements. This is not the final drawing, but I'm much closer to where I want to be. And you can see I've introduced some shrubbery into the desert, but it's a lot more sparse than where I started out. There's just like those little clusters and clumps of bushes that you typically see in places like Arizona or New Mexico in the US. And the nice thing about those bushes is they help reinforce scale. So in the foreground, you can really see much larger ones, and then in the background, they get smaller, and that helps establish a texture-based perspective, which is a very common way of reinforcing a sense of space. And right here you can see even though that city is very detailed, it's almost like a diagram, and I'm showing all of the objects in that city pretty clearly. The reason I do that is because my background is in industrial design, and when I'm doing renderings, I typically am almost explaining what's going on there, which is not really the purpose of this page right here. The purpose of this page is to establish a mood and a story. So if I'm showing that much detail in that city, I'm going off in the wrong tangent. And you can see now I've started to add another layer set to multiply mode, which is starting to lay in cast shadows and pushing some of that detail of the city back, so it's not sort of dominating the viewer as much. And another exercise in exactly the same thing, I'm adding more atmospheric perspective here. So I've created another layer that shows haze and mist. Not only does it push those buildings back further, but it's also flattening that city out. It's not making all that geometry quite as well rendered as it was, because again, I want to create that kind of telephoto lens effect where everything's just a little bit flatter. And another thing that that it needs to happen is I need to start unifying my color families a bit better, which also helps to weave together the whole composition. So I've added another layer with the blend mode set to color, and I'm just starting to selectively drop in some reds that unify that whole mid-ground city area. And then my last additional sort of global refinement of the composition is I've added another layer set to screen, which is just pulling out those last little bright highlights of the sunlight hitting those buildings in the background, just to sort of pop out a tiny hint of detail here and there to just create a little bit more interest and to just create a little bit more modeling of the forms. And that pretty much finishes up this panel here. I may or may not do a recording of the other panels depending on how much time I have available, but I hope that this has been helpful to you in your drawing endeavors, and I will talk to you next time. All right, bye.